Imagine for a moment that you could transport one of ancient history's most lethal warriors directly onto a modern battlefield, equipped only with his spear, his shield, and centuries of relentless training etched into every fiber of his being. What would happen when Spartan discipline, forged in the Rocky Mountains of Laconia, met combat drones, assault rifles, and digital communication systems that coordinate entire armies through satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above Earth? This isn't just science fiction fantasy. It's a fascinating window into how warfare has evolved over millennia and what truly separated these legendary warriors from contemporary soldiers. Today, we're diving deep into this thought experiment to reveal surprising truths about courage, technology, and the unchanging nature of human conflict. If you're not yet part of this community exploring history's most intriguing mysteries, subscribe to help us grow and continue bringing these reflections that connect past to present in unique ways. To truly understand the impact a Spartan warrior would have on modern conflict, we must first unearth the layers of myth and legend surrounding these men and delve into the brutal reality of their formation. Sparta wasn't just another Greek city-state, it was a war machine meticulously built over generations, where every aspect of civilian life was subordinated to creating perfect soldiers. From the moment a Spartan boy turned 7, he was torn from his family and thrust into the agoge, a military educational system so strict that only the most resilient survived to become full citizens. This process of natural selection created men who didn't know the concept of individual retreat, who had been conditioned from childhood to value honorable death above dishonorable life, and who possessed tactical unity that transformed each Spartan phalanx into a single lethal organism. When we think of modern conflicts, we tend to focus on technological superiority, weapons accuracy, and coordination through advanced communication systems. But one element has remained constant from Thermopylae to 21st century battlefields: the human factor, that indefinable combination of determination, discipline, and the ability to function under extreme pressure that separates ordinary soldiers from truly exceptional warriors. The question that intrigues us isn't whether a Spartan could simply learn to use modern technology, but rather how their mindset, conditioned reflexes, and combat philosophy would interact with an environment where death can come from miles away, where the enemy might be a drone operator sitting in a military base on the other side of the world, and where the very nature of courage needs redefinition for a context where individual bravery may be less relevant than the ability to process information quickly and make split-second tactical decisions. To fully immerse ourselves in this fascinating experiment, we must first reconstruct with historical accuracy who truly was a Spartan warrior at the height of their civilization, between the 7th and 4th centuries BC. Far from Hollywood depictions portraying them as muscular berserkers screaming on battlefields, Spartans were products of one of the most sophisticated and scientific military systems of the ancient world. Laconian society had developed over generations a soldier-rearing methodology that combined extreme physical fitness, deep psychological indoctrination, and tactical training that began in childhood and continued until death. When a Spartan boy entered the agoge at age 7, he wasn't simply entering military school. He was being inserted into a process of complete identity transformation. During the early years, these young men were deliberately malnourished to develop resistance to hunger, forced to sleep outdoors during harsh winters to build tolerance to extreme cold, and taught to steal food as part of their training in infiltration and survival. Those caught stealing weren't punished for the theft itself, but for the incompetence of being discovered, a subtle but fundamental distinction that revealed the pragmatic mindset defining all Spartan education. The physical training of these warriors focused not on building impressive muscles, but on developing extraordinary cardiovascular endurance, functional flexibility, and refined motor coordination. An adult Spartan could march for days carrying his full equipment, approximately 30 kilograms, maintaining perfect formation and arriving on the battlefield ready to fight immediately. Their diet was meticulously calculated to optimize performance. Lean proteins, whole grains, dried fruit, and the famous black broth, a soup of pig's blood, vinegar, and salt that provided essential nutrients and developed tolerance to unpleasant flavors that might be encountered during prolonged campaigns. But the most revolutionary aspect of Spartan preparation was its psychological component. These men were conditioned from childhood to function as cells of a larger organism, where individual survival was always subordinated to unit success. They practiced controlled breathing techniques to stay calm during combat chaos, developed mental mantras to overcome physical and emotional pain, and were trained to make instant tactical decisions based on almost imperceptible visual cues from their comrades. This mental cohesion was constantly tested through exercises where groups of warriors faced simulated life-or-death situations, creating emotional bonds that transcended normal family relationships. Spartan military technology, while simple compared to modern standards, was optimized for maximum efficiency within its historical context. The Dory spear, 2.5 meters long, was balanced with mathematical precision to allow fluid movement in both formation and individual combat. The hoplon shield, made of wood, bronze, and leather, weighed approximately 7 kilograms and was designed not only for personal protection, but as an extension of the collective phalanx, where each warrior partially protected the man to his right. The short, broad Xiphos sword was forged specifically for close combat in confined spaces where long spears became ineffective. The Spartan tactical system revolutionized ancient warfare through the hoplite phalanx, a formation where warriors organized themselves in dense, deep ranks, creating an impenetrable wall of spears and shields that advanced as a single entity. This tactic required perfect synchronization. Every step had to be coordinated, every spear movement calculated so as not to interfere with adjacent companions, and each warrior had to maintain position even when wounded or under extreme pressure. The discipline required to perform these maneuvers under enemy fire was developed through years of repetitive training that ingrained the movements in muscle memory until they became automatic reflexes. Now, let's mentally transport one of these warriors, say Cleomenes, a 30-year-old Spartan at the height of his physical and mental capacity, to a contemporary battlefield. Imagine that through some impossible temporal phenomenon, he materializes in the midst of a modern military operation, perhaps a reconnaissance mission in hostile urban terrain, where a special forces unit is advancing through bombed-out buildings while coordinating movements through digital communication systems and identifying targets using night vision equipment and thermal sensors. Cleomenes' first reaction would probably be complete sensory disorientation. His ears, trained to identify the sound of horses' hooves, the creaking of bronze armor, and war cries of enemies mere feet away, would be bombarded by noises he couldn't process. The constant hum of reconnaissance drones, the electronic crackle of radio communications, the distant whistle of missiles piercing the atmosphere at supersonic speeds. His eyes, accustomed to assessing threats within a radius of a few hundred meters, would try unsuccessfully to identify the source of explosions that emerge from the sky without warning, coming from invisible aircraft flying at altitudes beyond his comprehension. However, after the first few minutes of adaptation, certain fundamental characteristics of his training would begin to emerge. His ability to maintain composure under extreme stress, developed through decades of psychological conditioning, would allow him to overcome the initial shock and begin processing the hostile environment with the same analytical methodology he applied to ancient battlefields. Cleomenes would begin identifying patterns in modern soldiers' movements, instinctively recognizing universal tactical concepts such as cover, coordinated movement, and mutual protection, even when executed with completely alien equipment and techniques. His keen observation, trained to detect the slightest changes in opponents' and allies' body posture, would quickly identify the command hierarchy within the modern unit through subtle visual cues. Who makes decisions, who follows orders, who possesses specialized knowledge about specific equipment. This ability to read body language and group dynamics, essential for survival in phalanxes where verbal communication was often impossible due to combat noise, would translate naturally to the contemporary military environment. Cleomenes' extreme physical conditioning would also prove surprisingly relevant. While modern soldiers rely heavily on vehicles for transportation and electronic equipment for navigation, he would possess significant advantages in situations where technology fails or becomes unavailable. His ability to march for days without rest, survive on minimal rations, and maintain physical performance even when injured or sick could be crucial in prolonged survival scenarios or when supply lines are compromised. Even more fascinating would be observing how his hand-to-hand combat reflexes, refined through decades of melee weapons training, would adapt to modern weaponry use. Although he had never held an assault rifle, his instincts about positioning, timing, and energy conservation would apply directly to firearms combat. His intuitive understanding of how to use natural cover, how to move in ways that minimize exposure to enemy attacks, and how to coordinate actions with unit mates would represent transferable knowledge that transcends specific technological limitations. The real test for our warrior Cleomenes would come when he was forced to make critical tactical decisions using technology that completely challenges his understanding of the physical world. Imagine he's given a modern assault rifle, perhaps an M4A1, and observes contemporary soldiers using this equipment. His mind, trained to understand mechanics through direct observation, would quickly identify fundamental patterns. The equipment produces projectiles when a specific mechanism is triggered, accuracy depends on visual alignment through aiming devices, and ammunition conservation is crucial for sustainability in prolonged combat. What's fascinating is that Cleomenes would instinctively apply combat principles that remain valid regardless of specific technology used. His understanding of economy of movement, developed through years of wielding heavy spears and shields, would naturally translate into efficient shooting techniques that minimize fatigue and maximize accuracy. He would recognize that every shot must be deliberate and calculated, Just as every spear thrust in ancient combat needed specific purpose to avoid wasting energy and unnecessary exposure to enemy counterattacks. But the truly transformative moment would come when Cleomenes was exposed to the most advanced aspects of modern warfare. Distributed command and control systems, real-time intelligence collected through satellites and drones, and coordination of multiple units through encrypted digital communications. Initially, this complexity would leave him completely lost, as his entire military experience was based on direct visual communication and decentralized decision-making within small, cohesive groups. However, his ability to adapt, forged through decades of facing life-or-death situations where mental flexibility was a matter of survival, would allow him to gradually understand the fundamental principles behind these systems. Cleomenes would recognize that, regardless of technological complexity, war still consists of coordinating multiple individuals' actions to achieve specific tactical objectives, protect allies, and neutralize enemy threats. This essential understanding would give him a conceptual basis to begin assimilating information about modern military technology. Spartan mental discipline would prove particularly valuable in situations where modern soldiers face information overload. Contemporary military operators often need to simultaneously process data from multiple sources: radio communications, visual information from digital displays, environmental sensors, and direct battlefield observation. This cognitive multitasking can cause decisional paralysis in inadequately trained individuals, but Cleomenes would possess unique advantages derived from his Spartan upbringing. Since childhood, he had been conditioned to filter out irrelevant information and focus exclusively on data directly impacting mission survival and success. This laser-focused ability, developed through exercises where distraction meant simulated death or severe punishment, would allow him to navigate modern informational complexity with astonishing efficiency. He would instinctively prioritize communications related to enemy positions, wounded ally status, and tactical changes requiring immediate response, ignoring secondary data that could wait for later processing. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this temporal transplantation would be observing how the Spartan mindset about courage and sacrifice would adapt to conflicts where individual heroism can be counterproductive. In ancient warfare, a brave warrior who advanced alone against enemy positions could inspire comrades and potentially change entire battle outcomes through dramatic action. In modern combat, this same type of individual initiative often results in unnecessary death and compromises the entire unit's safety. Cleomenes would need to reconcile his cultural programming that values glorious death over dishonorable life with tactical realities where preserving human resources is essential for long-term success. This psychological strain would represent his greatest adaptive challenge, forcing a fundamental re-evaluation of values that define his identity as a warrior. He would discover that true courage, in a modern context, often means suppressing heroic impulses in favor of calculated decisions that maximize collective effectiveness. The experience would become even more complex when Cleomenes was exposed to the ethical and legal dimensions of contemporary warfare. Modern soldiers operate within rules of engagement frameworks that limit when lethal force can be applied, require distinction between combatants and civilians, and impose liability for collateral damage. These constraints would be completely alien to a warrior trained in an era when war was seen as existential competition between civilizations, where mercy was often perceived as dangerous weakness, and where complete enemy destruction was considered desirable. Gradually, however, Cleomenes would begin understanding that these limitations don't represent weakness, but rather strategic sophistication reflecting complex geopolitical realities. He would recognize that modern warfare often aims at specific political objectives requiring preservation of social and economic structures, making indiscriminate destruction counterproductive to long-term goals. This understanding would expand his definition of victory beyond simple physical survival to include considerations of political legitimacy and result sustainability. The most telling moment would come when Cleomenes was forced to operate equipment requiring remote coordination with individuals he had never met in person. Spartan soldiers built trust through years of intense coexistence, developing emotional bonds that allowed instinctive coordination even in chaotic situations. Modern warfare often requires instant collaboration with distant specialists, air traffic controllers, intelligence analysts, support equipment operators, and commanders in operation centers located on different continents. This need to rely on unknown voices through electronic communication systems would initially profoundly challenge Spartan psychology, which was grounded in direct personal relationships and visual assessment of competence and character. Cleomenes would need to develop new psychological mechanisms to establish operational trust based on institutional protocols rather than intimate personal knowledge. Surprisingly, this adaptation could reveal aspects of his Spartan training that would uniquely apply to the modern military environment. His ability to suppress individual ego in favor of collective goals, developed through decades of phalanx formation training, could translate naturally to operations requiring subordination to distributed command systems. He would intuitively understand that effectiveness in modern warfare depends on each individual perfectly performing specialized functions within complex organizations, just as phalanx success depended on each warrior maintaining precise position and timing regardless of personal circumstances. Even more fascinating would be observing how Cleomenes would develop techniques to maintain morale and unit cohesion in an environment where enemies are often invisible and death can come without warning or opportunity for heroic response. Spartan soldiers maintained determination through group rituals, constant physical competition, and celebration of individual feats contributing to collective success. In modern warfare, where much combat occurs through automated systems and enemies can be engaged at distances preventing personal recognition, maintaining morale requires completely different psychological strategies. Cleomenes could contribute valuable knowledge on creating artificial unity bonds through techniques developed in the Spartan agoge. He would instinctively understand that soldiers need shared rituals, collective physical challenges, and recognition systems that validate individual contributions to group missions. This wisdom about combat psychology could be applied to improve cohesion in modern military units that often suffer from technological isolation and lack of emotional connection between members. The experiment would reach its climax when Cleomenes was called upon to lead a mixed unit of modern soldiers during a critical operation where technological systems failed and the mission depended solely on human leadership and decision-making under extreme pressure. At this moment, his decades of training in commanding small units, developed through exercises where he was responsible for fellow Spartan survival, would prove completely transferable to a contemporary military environment. His ability to maintain absolute composure during chaos, communicate tactical decisions through gestures and facial expressions when verbal communication is impossible, and inspire confidence through personal example would represent skills that transcend specific technological limitations. Modern soldiers, accustomed to relying on electronic equipment for coordination, might discover that fundamental leadership principles remain constant regardless of available technological sophistication. The experience would transform both Cleomenes and the contemporary soldiers with whom he interacted. He would learn that modern warfare requires kinds of courage his ancestors couldn't have imagined. Courage to make decisions affecting thousands of people one will never meet in person. Courage to operate equipment whose complexity exceeds full individual comprehension. And courage to accept responsibility for consequences extending far beyond the immediate battlefield. Modern soldiers, for their part, would discover that certain fundamental warrior qualities, mental discipline, absolute loyalty to comrades, and willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for higher goals, remain as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago in the rocky hills of Laconia. As we reach the end of this journey through time and imagination, we're confronted with a profound truth that transcends simple curiosity about ancient warriors on modern battlefields. The thought experiment we've just explored reveals that despite all the extraordinary technological advances separating our era from classical Sparta, the fundamental elements defining a true warrior remain surprisingly constant through millennia. Cleomenes, our transplanted Spartan in the 21st century, would discover that his greatest advantages wouldn't lie in his physical strength or skill with ancient weapons, but rather in the intangible qualities the agoge had etched into his soul. The ability to function effectively under extreme pressure, the mental discipline to stay focused during absolute chaos, and most importantly, the deep understanding that true military strength emerges from diverse individuals' ability to function as a single, cohesive organism. These traits, developed through methods many would consider primitive, would prove not only relevant but essential in an environment where technological complexity can easily overwhelm soldiers lacking a solid psychological foundation. The most striking lesson emerging from this reflection is the realization that our contemporary society, for all its technological sophistication, may be losing touch with fundamental principles about human resilience, voluntary discipline, and sacrifice for higher goals that defined ancient civilizations like Sparta. We live in an era where convenience and comfort are often prioritized over character development, where physical and mental challenges are avoided rather than embraced as growth opportunities, and where the idea of subordinating individual desires to collective needs is viewed with suspicion rather than admiration. However, this experiment also shows us that evolution isn't necessarily synonymous with progress in all dimensions of human experience. While our military technology has advanced in unparalleled ways, creating capabilities the Spartans couldn't even dream of, we've lost certain qualities that made these warriors unique. The simplicity of purpose that eliminates unnecessary distractions, the serene acceptance that some situations require absolute sacrifice, and the intuitive understanding that true freedom emerges from voluntary discipline rather than absence of restraint. What makes this reflection particularly relevant to our historical moment is recognizing that we face contemporary challenges requiring exactly the qualities we admired in Cleomenes. Global pandemics testing our ability to sacrifice personal convenience for the collective good, climate change requiring discipline to alter comfortable but unsustainable habits, and geopolitical tensions requiring courageous leadership willing to make unpopular but necessary decisions. In each of these scenarios, Spartan virtues of endurance, discipline, and long-term thinking reveal themselves not as curious historical relics, but as urgent necessities for successfully navigating 21st-century complexities. Perhaps the most provocative conclusion to this exploration is recognizing that if we could transport a Spartan to our time, he might be not only confused by our technology, but genuinely perplexed by our apparent reluctance to apply the principles of excellence, sacrifice, and collective discipline that we find admirable when studying ancient civilizations but avoid implementing in our own lives and contemporary societies. If you've made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share in the comments which aspect of the Spartan mindset impressed you most and how you believe you could apply these principles in your own life.